Hi guys, I'm going to be helping you do some review over fractions. So we're going to be doing simplifying, finding least common denominator, and adding and subtracting. So here we have a fraction is fully reduced, which means fully simplified, when the only number that divides evenly into both the numerator and the denominator is 1. And I'm going to be explaining that a little bit more as I do simplify these two fractions. Remember, the numerator is the top part of the fraction and the denominator is the bottom part of the fraction. So first of all, we can see here on this first one that our numerator is larger than our denominator, which means that this fraction is larger than 1. So we ask ourselves, how many 10s are in 12? And there is 1 10 in 12. And then if I take these two numbers and I subtract them, I'm left with 2 10s. So far we've got a mixed number here now. So this was improper, and now I made it into a mixed number. Now I can simplify this part of my fraction. And I can see both of these numbers are even, so I can divide them by 2. And I'm left with 1 and 1/5. So see that this number can only be divided by 1, and this number can be divided by 5 or 1. Because they both can only be divided by 1, that means it is simplified. It's reduced. It's fully reduced. All right, example 2. In this example, the numerator is smaller than the denominator. So that means that it is not a full 1. Okay, so we have a part of a whole. So I'm going to divide both of these by 2 because they're even numbers. And we have 21 over 28. Okay. Now when you get here, now we got to figure out what number these ones can be divided by. And I know this one can be divided by 3, but it can't be divided by 2 because it's not even. This one can't be divided by 3 because when I add the two digits, 2 plus 8 makes 10, and 10 is not divisible by 3. And I know this one's not divisible by 4 because 4 times 5 makes 20. But this one is divisible by 4. They're both not divisible by 5 because they don't end in a 0 or a 5. And they're not divisible by 6 because I know that this one is not divisible by 6 because 6 times 3 is 18 and 6 times 4 is 24. So I'm going to have to try 7. So they both can be divided by 7, and that makes 3 out of 4. And now, whoops, sorry guys. All right, so now that is fully simplified because 3 can only be divided by 3 and 1, and 4 can only be divided by 1 or 2. Because they can't be divided by anything other than what they have in common is 1, it's fully reduced. All right, so now we're going to work with least common denominator. So we're talking about the denominator here. So the least common denominator, so we're going to fill in the blank. The least common denominator is the smallest of all the possible common denominators. So look at your denominators and find its multiple. So this is the denominator. It's 3. So we're going to write out some of the multiples of 3. So 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21. Okay. Now I'm going to write out my multiples of 6 on this one. So 6, 12, 18, 24, 30, 36, 42. Okay? So we're going to find the smallest number that is the same. So I'm going to look through and I'm like, oh, both have 6. And I'm going to circle them. So that is my least common denominator. So I'm going to look at the multiples I circled. In order to get the common denominator, so I'm on step 3. You need to multiply the numerator and denominator by that factor. Okay, so let's think about what that means. So this one already has 1/6. I don't have to touch 1/6 because they both have the 6 in common. So I don't have to do anything with that. But I have to change this one with a denominator of 6. So the factor they're talking about is it's the second one. See, it's the second multiple. So that means I'm going to have to multiply 3 times 2. To make 6, and then I multiply 1 times 2 to make 6. So now I have common denominators because they both have 6 on the bottom. Okay, that's the least common denominator. I could have made it with another one. I could have both made them into, I see they both have 12 in common. So I could have done, and that is the, for this one, that is the fourth number, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm going to multiply it times 4. And that is 4 out of 12. And then this one, it's the second one, so I'm going to multiply 1/6 times 2 over 2, which gives me 2 over 12. Now I did make another common denominator. This is the least common denominator, but here's another common denominator. Okay, we have to have common denominator when we're adding and subtracting fractions, so that's why we're working on this. And the big thing to remember is we have to multiply the numerator and the denominator by the same number. And you're really just multiplying it by 1, because 4 divided by 4 is 1, 2 divided by 2 is 1. So we're just making it with different numbers, okay? So we're making, what we call these are equivalent fractions. See how I made a little equal sign? Equivalent fractions. So now we're going to move on to adding and subtracting fractions. So when we're adding fractions, the denominators, like I said, need to be the same. If they're not, we're going to have to change them. And the easiest way is to find that least common denominator so we don't have to change them into such large numbers. And then we're going to add or subtract the numerators only. And if I'm adding a mixed number, the whole numbers first, okay? So I'm going to go through what that looks like. And I know that it says if you're subtracting a mixed number, change it in improper fractions, but I'm going to show you another way called regrouping. All right, so let's do the adding first. So we have these, we already got our common denominator over here for 1/3 and 1/6. So I'm just going to go ahead and rewrite it. Remember, we got 2/6 plus 1/6. Now we're writing it, we're adding the numerators together and then keeping the denominator same. So we got 3 out of 6 because we added the 2 and the 1. We got 3 out of 6. Now we always have to do what for our fractions? What we did at the beginning is simplify. Okay, so they both have in common 3. So we're going to divide by 3, and we're going to be left with 1/2. So 1/3 and 1/6 together makes 1/2. Okay, but now they said, what if you have two mixed numbers? Since we lined them up, it's really easy. We're gonna add the whole numbers and then add the fractions. Okay, but before we add the fractions, we got to make sure we have common denominator, and we do not. Okay, so I can see that this is 15 and this is 5. So this one ends in a 5. Because of that, I know that I can get this 5 to a number that ends in a 5. So I can only change the 2/5. So let's see. So 5 times what makes 15? Times 3. 2 times 3 makes 6. Okay. So now I'm going to add the whole numbers. 1 and 3 makes 4. Now I have the common denominator. I'm going to add the numerators. 4 and 6 makes 10. And the denominator stays the same. And then we have to simplify. And we just have to simplify. Oh, wait. That can't be divided by 2. I'm so silly. It's going to be divided by 5. Because they end in a 0 or 5. And that's going to be 4 and 2/3. Okay, and we're done with that one. Now sometimes the denominator, both the denominator, like, so we turned this one into this denominator right here, right? But sometimes we won't be able to do that. We're going to have to find one that they both have in common. So, like, for example, we may have to have one that's farther down the line of our multiples, okay? So make sure when you're doing your activity later, you're looking for that. It's not always going to be just one of the other denominators. Okay, so subtracting, we're going to do the same thing. Let's find common denominator, but we're going to subtract the numerators instead of adding them. Okay, so I can see here that this one's 5 and this one's 10. I'm going to go ahead and make it into a different one, because I've showed you how we can make I'm using least common denominator. I'm going to make one using just another common denominator, so you can see that. Okay, so I'm going to do 20, because I know 5 times 4 makes 20, and 1 times 4 is 4. So I made it out of 20. And I can change 10 into 20 as well, because 20 is a multiple of 20 is a multiple of 10. Okay, it's the second one. So I'm going to multiply it times 2, and I'm going to get 2 out of 20. I'm just doing this to show you that sometimes that you don't have to have the larger of the denominators here. It might be some whole new denominator. So now we're just going to subtract the numerators. 4 minus 2 is 2, and keep the denominator the same. And now we can simplify. Divide by 2, and we're left with 1/10. Okay? All right, so now here's subtracting with mixed numbers. All right, so like I said, you can make them improper and then subtract the numerators and then simplify, but I think that's a lot of work. So what I'm going to show you how to do is to regroup, okay? So first of all, we first have to get both fractions to have common denominators. That's always first. So I'm just going to rewrite 3 1/4 because I know that 4 is going to be the common denominator because 2 times 2 makes 4. And this is going to turn into 2/4. All right, this is the problem. You can't subtract 1 from 2. So we're going to borrow from this whole number. And this whole number is going to turn into 2. All right? And this now, since we borrowed, the whole is 4, right? Because in order to make this fraction a whole, it has to be 4/4. So if we take a whole from here, we're going to add it to the numerator here. And that is now going to become 5/4. Okay, let me explain that again. What I did was I took away the whole number and made it 2. So in order to take a whole, to add the whole to the fraction, I have to add 1. And to make 1 is 4/4. It already had 1, remember? So I added the 4/4 plus 1/4, which makes 5/4. Now I can subtract the numerators. 5 minus 2 is 3. Keep the denominator the same. And now it's 2 minus 0. There's no whole here. So it's 2 3/4. Okay? So that is adding and subtracting fractions, simplifying, finding common denominator, all that review that you from 5th grade. Okay? So now you're going to use your notes to go ahead and go through your Schoology assignments. And if you have any questions, we'll be going through them at the end of class.
For adding and subtracting decimals, it's very straightforward, same thing as elementary school. First thing we do is line up the decimals. And we add trailing zeros if needed. Now we did that kind of when we compared decimals, so that should be something that we're used to. Then we add or subtract, just depending on what's going on. And for adding and subtracting decimals, they always bring down the decimal. Bring down the decimal. So some of you might be able to do this on your own. Okay, I'm going to go through it step by step, so if anyone doesn't understand, you have this opportunity. So we have 12 25 hundredths plus 6 4/10. So 12 25 hundredths, use my decimal point, plus 6 4/10. See how I line up my decimals? Now notice I have an empty space right here. Fill that in with a trailing 0. That way it's a little bit easier to add. You don't have to put a trailing 0, but it helps you understand why and how we get our answers. 5 plus 0, we get 5. 2 plus 4, we get 6. Bring down your decimal. 6 plus 2 is 8. 1 plus nothing is 1. So my answer is 18 65 hundredths. Now remember, always rewrite it, see what you need to do, add those trailing zeros. Sometimes you might get a fraction and a decimal in the same question. All you have to do in that case is convert them all to decimals or all to fractions and work it out. Example 2. 20 minus 14 96 hundredths. So I have 20 minus 14 96 hundredths. Now notice there's a lot of space with my 20. All we have to do in that case is, again, add a decimal and then add my trailing zeros. If you don't add a decimal, that's saying like 2,000. That's not what we want. So we add the decimal point, add our trailing zeros. And now we just subtract, as if we were subtracting like normal. I can't do 0 minus 6. I can't do 0 minus 9. I can't do 0 minus 4. So we borrow. and you carry it on over. Carry it on over. 10 minus 6 gets us 4. 9 minus 9 is 0. Bring down your decimal. 9 minus 4 is 5. 1 minus 1 is 0. So 5 and 4 tenths. I'm sorry, 5 and 4 hundredths. Decimals are a quick, easy, straightforward one. So really don't have to do too much. Very straightforward.